behind a failed model of prohibition, a model that has made organized crime rich and left our young people vulnerable. In its place, we will have a new system that will give adults the opportunity to purchase and consume cannabis legally from authorized suppliers.
Now, we know there are plenty of questions out there about how this will work, and the CBC's Catherine Cullen is on the lawn on Parliament Hill to answer some of them. So we're also streaming this live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So please join in the conversation. Head over to CBC News Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/CBC News, and leave your questions in the comments section. We'll try and answer them with Catherine. So first of all, Catherine, let's start with the political part of all of this, because that's how this is happening. The Senate vote, the bill passed 52 to 29 with 2 abstentions. So how did that break down politically?
Well, it was a lot of Conservatives that did oppose the legislation, and that is perhaps not a surprise. They've been quite vocal both on the House side and on the Senate side. This is not something they particularly like. We should say not necessarily all Conservatives, and perhaps worth noting that in fact 2 members of the Conservative Senate caucus actually recused themselves from voting because they have financial interests that mean that they are going to benefit from legalization. In one case, an investment, another case, it's a piece of real estate. Which is going to be used as a dispensary in one of the provinces, and so they recused themselves from the votes. The big question really going into yesterday, because this is the second time the Senate has come around to this question of pot legalization, was whether or not the independents were going to be on side with the government's plan. There was a real fight primarily around the question of growing marijuana at home. One of the things in the federal legislation says people can grow 4 plants per household just for their own personal use. Some provinces want to ban it. There's been a bit of a face-off over that. Some independent senators weren't thrilled with how the government's handled that issue, but in the end, they said, listen, the folks on the House of Commons side, they're the elected representatives. This was an election promise, and they passed the legislation last night.
And so, Catherine, we're told it'll be 8 to 12 weeks before recreational weed becomes legal. So what happens between now and then?
Well, one thing that looks like it's going to happen today, if not in the next few days, is we're going to find out precisely what the date is, Andrew. And obviously there's a lot of interest in that. Normally you have a piece of legislation, when it passes, it gets royal assent, the Governor General signs off on it, comes into force right away. In this case, it's a little bit of a special scenario where they're going to be delaying it to give the provinces, they say, the federal government says, time to get ready for legalization. They have to do things like actually get the recreational marijuana into the various storefronts. There's still work that police forces need to do in order to be prepared for this. Presuming the new impaired driving legislation passes, for instance, they're going to start using saliva tests to find out whether or not people might be suspected of drug impaired driving. So there's training that has to happen, things like that. Still a lot more work that needs to be done. But today, or in the coming days, we expect to learn, and the Justice Minister said the news would come from the Prime Minister, precisely what the day is that the government is going to push the button on what is, by all accounts, a pretty historic change.
Yeah, it certainly is. And so, Catherine, just in practical terms, this does not mean, though, that people are going to be able to light up wherever they want.
Absolutely not. A few things. One thing that the government certainly wants to be very clear about, you made that joke earlier, Andrew, hold your lighters for now. Recreational marijuana has not been legalized yet. We're still talking, as we said, about another 8 to 12 weeks. So during this time, it's still against the law to consume it. On top of that, there are going to be very specific rules when it is legalized. They vary from province to province. I'm in Ontario right now, so are you. Here, no consuming recreational marijuana in any public places, and if you get caught breaking those rules, the first fine can be up to $1,000, subsequent fines $5,000. So for anybody who thought this was going to be a real free-for-all, and for some of the really passionate advocates for legalization, they argue this isn't even really true legalization because there are still so many rules, because big corporations are playing such a big role. The model, though, will look a bit different in other provinces. Alberta has a whole list of places that you can't consume recreational marijuana. They include sports fields, arenas, and my personal favorite, they did think to put zoos on there, Andrew. So no lighting up next to the pandas and monkeys.
Okay. So listen, we are
it's true.
starting.
It's a fact.
I believe you. It's just, I don't know. It's for whatever reason, somewhat amusing. Okay, Catherine, we are getting some questions from people online. This is what Barbara Roberts on Facebook had to say. What about those people What about those in jail for something that is not, or is about to become not, illegal anymore? Because there have been a lot of questions. The NDP actually, Catherine, is, you work in Ottawa, have been asking lots of questions about that, as have others concerned about these people that have been put in jail, and then all of a sudden it's soon to be the law of the land that you'll be able to smoke marijuana legally.
Yeah, and we were talking to some of the federal ministers involved in this file today. Essentially, the public safety minister is taking a look at the question of crimes like simple possession. So not trafficking, but some of the more basic crimes related to marijuana possession. There's some talk of potential amnesty or forgiveness for those particular crimes, but that is only going to come, the government has been very clear, after legalization. They're trying not to send mixed messages right now, so they don't want to say to people, hey, go out and break the law now and then it'll be taken off your record later. In fact, they haven't even promised that they are going to offer those people amnesty. They say it's something they're thinking about, something that they're looking at, but they say they're focused right now on putting the Cannabis Act into force, and that is where their attention is going to remain for the time being. The NDP, as you say, have been very vocal about saying that they are needlessly punishing people in the meantime, and that really none of this should be going on.
We were talking about, Catherine, how we've kind of said that we are only the Western industrialized country in the world to legalize recreational marijuana. Some people,
Yep.
I even this morning said, wait a second, there are a bunch of European countries, but I guess they decriminalize, they didn't legalize. Is that
It's a
how
different
it all
model.
It's a different model?
Yeah, you want to look at particular examples, but people are going to think of Amsterdam, the Netherlands, where I don't want to get the language wrong, but essentially it's okay to buy it, but the methods of production are still a bit murky. This really is a global first. The only other country that has legalized is Uruguay. They're a very different country from Canada, and I can tell you I've been following this file for a couple of years. I remember being at meetings where there were representatives from Jamaica, the UK, and those people, passionate advocates of cannabis legalization, I should say, so you know where they're coming from, but they are saying the world is watching Canada right now to see how effectively this works. Everyone acknowledges there are going to be some speed bumps, so certainly the folks around the planet will be watching to see what they are and how Canada handles it.
And you touched on this a little bit, but maybe expand on this, because this has been a concern that has been raised over and over again. John Larkin on Facebook says, do we have a good roadside test for people driving high?
So it's a bit of a complicated answer. There's a piece of legislation that's going to change the rules around impaired driving, both tougher rules for alcohol impaired driving and drug impaired driving. It hasn't passed yet, but the expectation is that's going to happen in the next 48 hours. So let's talk about what that will look like. The first step we expect is going to be those saliva tests I mentioned a moment ago, but it's sort of a red light, green light system. So if you're suspected of drug impaired driving, they would take a saliva sample, the police officer would. It would basically say there are drugs in your system or there aren't, not just THC, but also cocaine and methamphetamines. So if you fail that test, then there's additional steps. A drug recognition expert, which is a specially trained police officer who is used right now because drug impaired driving is an issue right now, would try to assess you for your level of impairment. The new legislation also talks about taking blood from people who are suspected of impaired driving to try to determine their level of impairment. And there's some really interesting questions about how that's going to work. You need to be a certified technician. What does that mean exactly? Are police officers going to be taking people to hospitals? Are they going to be contracting out clinics? And I can tell you, I've been speaking to some police forces around it. It's a complex question, but the message certainly from the government is drug impaired driving is illegal right now. They can stop you and pull you over for it right now. They have the means of testing you for it. While the system might change, they will still be stopping you afterwards.
And it's just not a good idea. Just don't do it. It's just not smart. Catherine, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to leave
welcome.
Catherine now, but this conversation is going to continue on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and Catherine will be taking your questions live for the next little while. Again, that's at CBC News' Facebook page, facebook.com/CBC News, lots of addresses, and youtube.com/CBC News. CBC News is learning.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Taking over here to do this interactive Facebook, YouTube, Twitter live with you. And we've already got some questions coming in. Jennifer Vega wants to know what happens when minors are caught smoking, and it seems like we're getting several questions about providing marijuana to minors. Now, there's a limit to how much a minor is supposed to have on them. And this has actually been a pretty contentious topic. I think, if I recall correctly, it's 5 grams that a minor can have on them without facing any consequences whatsoever. But writ large, the idea of this whole new system of legalization is supposed to be, according to the government, protecting young Canadians, who the government points to surveys, one in particular involving the UN and the World Health Organization, that show that Canadian youth are the highest users, no pun intended, the greatest, let's say, users of marijuana in the world. So the idea is to keep them away from it. Now, the particularly strong penalties that are going to come into play, and some of them are in Bill C-45, have to do with providing marijuana to minors. So if you're an adult and you're caught using that, or if you're caught using a minor in order to traffic marijuana illegally, the penalties are pretty severe. Sentences of up to 14 years in jail. So the idea behind the system is supposed to be that it protects young people, keeps them out of the criminal justice system, but that if you're involved in providing it to minors, you're going to face some pretty strict and severe penalties. Cameron on Facebook wants to know, how will limits on the number of household plants be enforced? Cameron, that's a great question, one I have wondered about myself. There is widespread acknowledgement that that is going to be a very difficult thing to police. Now, the federal legislation says 4 plants per household. I mentioned earlier, Quebec, Manitoba, Nunavut want to ban home grow entirely. And there are some interesting restrictions, depending on which province you look at, about where you can grow it, inside, outside. New Brunswick, for instance, wants you to keep your marijuana in a locked container or a locked room. But this question of policing does become a complicated one. Interestingly, when this legislation was first announced, not only was it 4 plants per household, but they couldn't be more than a meter high. And someone realized the idea of police officers running around with tape measures was probably not a very practical one. So that was stripped out of the legislation. But it seems to me, and police forces have acknowledged this, it's going to be difficult to police. It seems that you would imagine it was only something that the police would bust you for, if it is indeed going to be police and not bylaw officers, because that is not entirely clear, that they would already have to be in your house, or perhaps if you're growing it outdoors, perhaps there's some sort of complaint. But it's not entirely obvious, frankly, how they're going to become aware of these situations and whether or not this is going to be anybody's top priority. So the question around home cultivation, definitely one to watch when legalization kicks in. Lenore Sigrid Clemens on Facebook, what about bylaws about odors from homes from smoking or growing, and those for whom secondhand smoke compromises their health? This is another example of an issue that's going to change from province to province. It may even change depending on where you live. I believe there's quite a prominent example of a condominium in Toronto that's gone smoke-free. Some condominiums, I should say, that are banning the practice entirely. A new one that's being built that's smoke-free entirely, and we're talking about both tobacco and cannabis smoke. There will be restrictions. I mean, the law itself says you can consume it in your home. Whether or not you're going to run into trouble with your landlord, whether or not you're going to run into trouble with your building owner, whether or not your municipality has created laws to restrict this, that remains to be seen. So perhaps it's not a terribly satisfying answer, but I think the answer is that you have to look into what the circumstances are, where you live, and whether or not there are restrictions. It will be interesting to see, frankly, if that is the subject of court challenges as well. I guess I would say it's probably prudent to think about what the situation is with cigarette smoke in the place where you live right now, if there are any restrictions around that. Perhaps it will be comparable, but at the end of the day, you've got to look into your particular situation. Daniel Lopez wants to know, what will the situation of paraphernalia be after the legalization of use? I'm not quite sure. So we're talking about like pipes and bongs and things like that. I have not seen anything to suggest that there will be restrictions on that. The restrictions, certainly the ones I'm more familiar with, and feel free to read the Cannabis Act, Bill C-45, if you'd like more specifics. But the principal restriction that the government has spoken about is the restrictions on possession of cannabis in public spaces. The federal limit is 30 grams that you can have on you in a public space that you can transport without getting into trouble. You get beyond that, that's when potentially you may have some issues with the authorities. I think that's when there would start to be concerns about trafficking and whatnot. Clint Fleury on Facebook says, so what happens next? Well, Clint, The number one thing is finding out when the date is going to be. So that's what we're waiting to see. And as I said, we expect to hear that. The Justice Minister says the Prime Minister is going to tell us. Could be as early as today. Question period starts in 45 minutes. Will it come up there? The Prime Minister has a news conference about 3 hours from now. It's his end of session news conference. Might he decide to reveal the date there? We will see. The government has said it will be 8 to 12 weeks. So what is happening now? The bill actually needs to be signed by the Governor General. That's a technicality, though, essentially. I mean, it's a very important technicality, but it hasn't happened yet. The real work that is going to be happening and is already happening across the country is stores getting ready to sell this, bringing in the cannabis itself. Interestingly, just about a week ago, Cannabis NB, which is the government-run, like the Crown Corporation or whatever, opened their first store. They gave a tour to the media. They seem to be quite prepared for this. And the president of Cannabis New Brunswick said, "This is the first government-run pot store in the world." And if you think about it, I mentioned Uruguay is the only other country that's doing this on a national level. They sell it through pharmacies. In the US, it's state by state. I'm not aware of any federally run dispensaries. So it's entirely possible that that's right, but there's a lot of work being done to get ready the spaces in which you are going to sell this stuff, train up the people who are going to be selling it, prepare law enforcement, teach them how to use these new tools like the saliva test, answer questions like the ones that I talked about earlier about how the logistics of some of this testing is going to work. We talked a moment ago about condo boards and landlords and tenants. Some of that discussion will be going on. But it is going to be a very, very busy time. Another interesting question is about how much passion police will show in policing the laws between now and whatever the day of legalization is. Again, the government has been crystal clear it will remain illegal, but it will be interesting to see whether some people expect more permissiveness, smoking marijuana out in the streets. I know in some big Canadian cities right now with dispensaries, we're seeing that already. Well, that is certainly against the new set of laws that Ontario, for instance, has put into place. Will there be attempts to crack down, or will everybody be a little bit more loosey-goosey? The government certainly hopes, the federal government, that people are going to follow the law, but we're going to watch and see there as well. Corey Crowder, can we start growing now? It won't be ready to use in 8 to 12 weeks. Pretty sure the answer to that is no. I think there are rules about like sourcing your seeds and whatnot. I'm going to just try to take a look at my handy dandy sheet here. Home cultivation from legal seeds or seedlings. So I'm not sure, Corey, where you would be getting those legal seeds or seedlings when recreational marijuana isn't legal yet. So again, that's that same message that the government would like everybody to hear. It's not legal till it's legal, and it's not legal yet. Haley on YouTube, I own a single-family detached home. What do I do if my neighbor is frequently smoking pot outside and the smell is now in my backyard, meaning I can't enjoy my own yard? Well, Haley, again, it depends what province or territory you live in and what the restrictions are on use there. I suppose like any other concern or nuisance, you can complain to the authorities if it is indeed a violation of the rules in your community. But because it does change so much from province to province and whatnot, I can't say for certain. That might be something to inquire with the city or the municipality about. Brenda Groovy Murray on Facebook, what happens if the US border asks if you use cannabis? Great question. Brendan. That's an excellent question and a contentious one. In fact, we were just asking some of the ministers in charge of this file about this today. Ralph Goodale, who's the Public Safety Minister for Canada, has been in discussions with his US counterparts to try to get a little bit more security for Canadians about what kinds of questions might be asked at the border. But the government has also said quite clearly they don't control what questions another country asks. We have control over our own borders. The Americans have control over their own border. You should always answer the authorities honestly, is obviously the advice that you're getting from the government. I don't think you could expect anything else. You're not supposed to lie to border agents. So you need to be forthright, but it is possible that you could be refused entry for doing something that is legal in Canada, but not legal in the United States. It's a legitimate source of concern. There are even just concerns that there will be slowdowns at the border, that it will take more time to cross the border. Certainly no agreement has been secured yet. And frankly, it's not clear that one will be. And if you've been following the news, and if you're writing into us, I'm sure you have, there's a lot going on the Canada-US file right now. I don't really know where this stands in the list of priorities. So it's a legitimate concern. Another thing that's important to say, it will remain illegal to move cannabis across the border. So even if you were going from Canada to a US state where recreational marijuana is legal, taking it across the border is against the law. It's a terrible idea. Don't do it. All right. Fergus on Facebook. When cannabis is legalized, can the industry become a private industry or a crown industry? So there are licensed producers, dozens upon dozens of them, currently growing medical cannabis, but a lot of the cannabis that they're growing right now is actually destined for the recreational market. All of those are private corporations. The government doesn't tend to make room for craft cannabis, micro processors, micro growers who will grow like a fairly small quantity of cannabis. But there's a lot of big and medium-sized corporations that are involved in this business. As for crown corporations, again, I'm going to go back to that idea that provinces and territories, the situation changes. But here in Ontario, for instance, when we buy liquor, we buy it through the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, the LCBO. There is a similar crown corporation, Ontario Cannabis, I'm going to say Society, what the S stands for, it's escaping me right now. They're the ones who are going to sell recreational marijuana in storefronts. You'll also be able to buy it online and I think just about everywhere in Canada. So some provinces have opted to go the route of private retail sales, and some provinces have opted to go the route of crown corporations. Frankly, it's a bit like alcohol in that sense, right? Depending on where you are in the country, you can buy it from different folks. That is what this is going to look like across Canada. One thing that I find interesting, so I'm going to tell you about it, is that mostly when it's done by a public corporation, it's sold in a different place from alcohol, because public health experts, many of them will tell you it's not a great idea to make it easy for people to, grab a bottle of wine and a significant quantity of cannabis at the same time. Getting drunk plus getting high does not, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. It's a multiplier effect, public health officials will tell you. So people could become extremely intoxicated. You don't want to encourage that. Obviously, there are risks that come along with that. Most provinces have decided to separate the two. Nova Scotia, though, will be selling cannabis in storefronts that are alongside the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission. I think they only have one storefront that will be cannabis only, and some places in Newfoundland also you'll be able to buy it in the same place. So it will be, for lack of a better word, interesting to see whether or not there are negative consequences to that. As I say, some public health officials have warned against it, but you can understand that there are practicalities too that communities are trying to deal with in terms of having trained staff, finding the space to do this and whatnot. All right. Mark Collins on YouTube. Are they saying there's absolutely no smoking any marijuana at all while driving? Yes. I'm pretty sure that the law says the same way that you cannot drink a beer while you drive, you shouldn't be smoking marijuana while you drive. That was quick, eh, Mark? Sandy V, I wonder why they legalized it. Could you explain? Happily. The government has been pretty clear about this. They believe that too many young Canadians have access to marijuana, underage people, and they say that a better way to control it and to stop young Canadians from using this drug is to legalize it. Part of the government's argument has been that they think it's easier for young Canadians to score some weed than it is to get a cigarette, for instance, right? Or buy a beer. So they say they're trying to make it tougher for kids to get access. At the same time, they are trying to shut down the organized crime networks that are involved in selling all of this. So that is supposed to be the benefit. Now, particularly on organized crime, it's clear that that's not going to happen overnight. And frankly, it's not entirely clear to what extent that will happen at all. There was an RCMP assistant commissioner who told the House of Commons it was naive to think that crime could completely be removed from this particular realm. But those are the two primary things that the government talks about. It was interesting, Peter Harder, who is the government facilitator in the Senate, the other night was up giving his speech, and he talked about, particularly as it relates to home grow, the idea that the government thinks that, adults should be able to grow a little bit of marijuana in their home if they so choose, the same way that you can, make your own beer, make your own wine. That hasn't been so much a part of the government's discourse on this. It's been very social security, justice, law and order focused. It hasn't really been that much a discussion about personal freedom. The tone here has been quite serious. Brian Terrier on Facebook, can we fly in Canada with marijuana? That's a good question, Brian. I have to say off the top of my head, I do not know, but I suspect typically when you look at these things, is it going to be treated the same way alcohol and cigarettes would be? Like, you're certainly not going to be able to light up on a plane, one imagines, but transporting it within the country, I don't know. I don't want to give you bad advice. You should double check, but I'm not aware of any prohibitions. Definitely what is a source of concern is taking it to other countries. I mentioned this before, but bringing it across the border, whatever that border might be, is a clear no-no. That is definitely going to get you into trouble. But I'm going to look into that. Brian, I'll try and tweet out the answer too, because I think that's a really good question. All right, now I do not know that we have any more questions. We'll just give this a second, and if not, we will wrap this up in a minute. Since we are, it looks like, getting to the end of this discussion, I'll just say again, I think the number one question most people must have is, when is this going to be a reality? We don't know yet. We expect to hear a date. The Justice Minister has said that it's probably the Prime Minister who's going to reveal it. We expect that's going to come very soon, possibly as early as today, that it will be something like 8 to 12 weeks from now, so August or September, in order to give the provinces and everyone involved in this whole process time to prepare. But make no mistake, this is a pretty big change. Whether you like it or you don't, you think it's a great idea or a terrible idea, it puts Canada in a pretty unique place in the world, ending 95 years of prohibition against cannabis, the only industrialized nation in the world to do this. It is a big step. You know, I know you can look at it through a different lens and go, hey, people are using this already, what's the big deal? But on a global scale, it's a pretty big change, and it brings a lot of very interesting questions with it. And thank you, everybody who sent us in questions today. Got one more. Lindy Marianne Trail, where is the tax money going to go from it? Great question, Lindy. So the government has put a 10% excise tax on marijuana. That right now is all going into, it's being split between the provinces and the federal government. Certainly from the federal standpoint, it's all going into the expenses around this, because this is expensive, right? You got to train police officers, new public education campaigns, you're setting up new storefronts. There is a whole, like there would be with any other product that you can consume, there's a whole sort of inspection process and whatnot that Health Canada is going to put into place. So a lot of governments, be they provincial, federal, territorial, municipal, say that this is going to cost them money up front to get the system set up. Now, a few years from now, it could be talking about some pretty significant profits. And in fact, some provinces are already projecting profits right now, but a lot of others are saying this is going to cost them more money than they're going to take in right out of the gate. And certainly the federal government has been careful to suggest that that is not the reason they are doing this. Last question is from Brian Eaton. He wants to know, what about edibles? They will not be legalized when legalization kicks in. One thing, though, that was included in C-45, the Cannabis Act, is that there will be another year before, or up to a year, before edibles can be sold in Canada. You can make your own. The legislation does say that. If you have legally procured recreational commercial cannabis, you can make your own cookies and brownies and whatnot. But you can't buy pre-made products like chocolate bars and that kind of thing. I think part of the reason for that is, if you look at examples like Colorado, there were numerous instances of poisonings, marijuana poisoning by kids. They'd get their hands on something, they'd think it was candy, often it looks like candy, and they'd end up in the hospital. And obviously that is not a situation that anybody wants to see. And so when edibles do become available, part of the restrictions say that you can't make anything that would be explicitly appealing to kids. So no weed gummy bears, even once edibles become a reality. And you're going to see too, when they do start selling products in all their forms, pretty plain packaging here. Real restrictions on what companies can do to market themselves. Again, child-proof locks on the packages, all sorts of warning symbols. There's a cannabis warning symbol that you're going to see all over the package. So restriction is certainly part of the name of the game here. I think that was the last question. So once again, thank you so much, everybody, for all your great questions. It's a big change. Several of the people who follow this file closely have said there are going to be bumps in the road. There are going to be some surprises here, unanticipated consequences. We're going to be watching carefully to see what they are try to bring you up to speed on all the information that you need. And hey, maybe we can do this again sometime. But thank you so much for your time. Have a great day. And thanks to everyone involved in the Facebook Live as well. Thanks to Nicole, Sarah, David, everybody who made this happen. Have a great day, guys.